Hello and welcome to Why Make, where we talk with makers from different disciplines about what inspires them to make, with your hosts Rob Helmkamp
and Eric Wolken. If you'd like to learn more about the makers we interview on Why Make, please go to our website, why-make.com.
And please help support the Why Make podcast and Why Make Productions by making a tax-deductible donation to us on Fractured Atlas.
Fractured Atlas is our new non-profit fiscal sponsor, which allows us to access a wide range of funding possibilities, including funding available only for nonprofits.
Visit fundraising.fracturedatlas.org/the-y-make-project or go to the Donate to Why Make page on why-make.com.
Welcome to episode 53 of Why Make. On this episode, we talk with Robert Lyon, a woodturner, artist, and educator who lives and works in the Columbia, South Carolina area.
Literally climbing the walls with handmade ladders as a small child, the sky was the limit, as Robert explored model rockets and building theater sets before landing in art school for college.
His lifetime in the arts started in ceramics when he discovered he could spend the whole day at the wheel and not notice the passage of time. No matter what he did, Robert always wanted every day to have that feel.
We talk with Robert about being an assistant professor at Louisiana State University, where he helped to set up one of the most vibrant ceramics programs in the United States at the time, before discovering the wood lathe.
After spending 5 years as an administrator, Robert returned to teaching full-time in the art department at the University of South Carolina until retiring in 2017. Since then, Robert has continued to teach and explore the lathe and lathe-turned forms.
Join us as Robert Lyon takes us back and forth across the Rio Grande, flowing through his mind's eye into those places where he finds inspiration.
And we'd like to thank Robert Lyon for joining us for the Why Make podcast.
Welcome to Why Make, Robert.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
And as we always like to start, we will start with the Why Make question, which, Robert, what is your first memory of making something?
Oh boy, my really first memory was as a little kid. I don't remember how old I was, but I would go down to the basement where my dad had a little bench that he had built just to keep some tools on and whatnot. And I would make little ladders that I would climb the basement walls with. And it would be literally that, just kind of 2x4s nailed together and just kind of walk up these things up the wall. And, eventually that started leading into other things. I used to make carbon arc lamps. I don't know if you remember those, but I used to take apart D-cell batteries and pull out the carbon rods and run a wire through a saltwater bath and plug these things in and bring them together and, make a carbon arc. But then I did other kinds of little things. I remember making a little sculpture of my mother in plaster and hooking rugs and that sort of thing. But as time went on, and this is where it kind of gets interesting.
You were a nerdy little kid.
I guess so. My dad was a chemist. And so.
What did your mom do?
My mom was a homemaker. So I had 2 sisters and a brother. And so there were 4 of us as kids. And I was the oldest. So I was, a lot of times, just doing things by myself. But, it wasn't until high school that I started getting into flying model rockets, building rockets and shooting them up.
I did that too. That's great.
Did you really?
Yeah.
And so I thought, maybe I should do something for the science fair. And this was sophomore year of high school. And I built these rockets and I built a maze, a big maze, a 4x4 foot plywood maze that I trained white mice to run the maze and would time them, how long it took to get to the middle to their food, right? And so then I built a centrifuge out of an old vacuum motor. And so I would spin them around, drop them into the maze, see how long it took for them to negotiate the maze. And then I would take them out to a local field, set up my maze, and launch them up in these model rockets, drop them down, and see how long it took for them to run. Well, it turns out that this whole project won me the New Jersey State Science Fair that year, which I guess was 1968. And not only that, but I won an award from the Army Aviation Association, from NASA, which included a trip to the Goddard Space Flight Center, which was awesome, by the way.
Wow.
And a trip to the National Youth Conference on the Atom, which was being held in Chicago that year, and one of the most memorable parts of that trip was meeting Muhammad Ali in the airport in Chicago. And
oh, wow.
I will have to say you probably won no awards from the Humane Society.
We've owned several cats, but no. So that sort of led me into thinking, I guess I'm going to go into science somehow. And, the next couple of years go by. My dad says, well, you're going to apply for college? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. But I never did, and I never did, and I never did. And it came time for a late registration at the local community college or go out and find a job. And so I said, well, I'll go. But senior year in high school, the school put on a big school play every year. Costumes from Brooks Van Horn in New York. They hired an orchestra to come in and play. And I was a stage manager for this play, and I loved it. I loved building all this stuff. So I walked into late registration and said, I'd like to study stage design. They said, well, we don't have that, but you'll need to take art classes. And so I said, okay. And they said, they can transfer. So I said, what do I take? And they signed me up for some things, and then I never looked back. I graduated from community college, went to the College of New Jersey. And from there, and that's where my first real experiences with craft came in, taking ceramics, metals, and as well as sculpture. And so after a couple of years there, I knew at this point, and so, one really interesting thing happened when I would go to the ceramic studio. I could, get there in the morning, 8:30 or something, look up at the clock in the studio. And the next thing I know, I look up at the clock and it's 5:00. And I said, no matter what I do in my life, it's got to feel like that. And, I don't want, checking, time for break, time for lunch, time to go home, I just want it to feel like a flow somehow. And so I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school and pursue this more. I ended up going to the Tyler School of Art, and it was a great decision. I mean, for me anyway. I just kept moving on.
So I'm assuming at Tyler, the ceramics program was based around sculpture and not functional objects?
Both Rudy and Bob made pot-oriented work. So I wouldn't say it was really focused that way towards sculptural objects, but that's what I made when I was there. Even, my first semester, everybody's accepted provisionally, and so you have to go through after a first semester, a review of what you've made. And so I was making all this modular stuff that was going to be assembled on the floor, and these big tile pieces, and so they were all stacked up like a library in my little studio area. And I remember Bob Whitaker coming in one time and he said, he didn't really understand how this was all going to fit together and go together. And he said, well, not everybody passes their review the first time. And I'm sure they don't. So I said, why are you telling me this? And he said, I just say you're not surprised. And, but as it turns out, I had no problem passing my first semester review, and went on and graduated in time.
Right. And did you experiment with other mediums while you were in school, or you were just mainly ceramics?
Yes. Well, I was primarily working clay, but then I was taking glass. And so learning to blow glass and cast glass. John Clark was the guy who was teaching glass at the time. And Italo Sconga was one of the sculpture faculty. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Lives on the West Coast now, I think. But Italo would bring Dale Trahuli down from RISD, along with Jamie Carpenter, and so we would get to know these guys a little bit. So it was an interesting time, and it was that glass experience that at Tyler that allowed me to build a glass studio at LSU when I went there in 1978 as an assistant professor. And so, I taught ceramics for about 8 years, I think, full time there. And we went from basically not a extremely well-known program, but in about 8 years, we were ranked, I think it was number 2 in U.S. News and World Report of ceramic programs in the country, just behind Alfred. So we did a lot of things. And
again, what was the focus of what you were teaching? You were teaching both functional ceramics as well as sculpture?
Yes, I would teach both wheel throwing and hand building as well as sculptural things. And when I was there, Joe would take me and his son Emil out. We did a couple camping trips out in West Texas, down into the Davis Mountains and Big Bend National Park. But what I would really see on these trips were dried riverbeds, and the clay content, of these riverbeds left this great crackle pattern in the riverbed. And so I'd come back and I started thinking about how can I duplicate this in some things that I wanted to make. So I started building wire forms, welded wire. I built several 3-foot square wire forms. And then I'd mix terracotta clay and I would apply it to this wire mesh and until it was completely covered, all 6 sides, and made them just big enough to fit into one of our largest kilns and fire these things. And they would come out like flexible. They would kind of shake.
Oh, weird.
Because the clay would crack, the wire would become annealed from the temperature of the firing. And so this thing would it would be kind of wobbly.
That's so weird.
That's right. It would kind of shake. And so I made a lot of different things using this technique and had a couple of shows actually. But transporting these things was a real bugger. It was very difficult, not to break them. So I started thinking about, how can I make a more permanent sort of thing? So I don't remember exactly what led me to this, but I thought maybe what I could do is mix a thick slurry, a thick clay slurry, and add glue to it and mix it up and apply it to wooden forms, like plywood forms or something. So I started to do that, and I would mix this clay and glue mixture and then paint. And this is just Elmer's glue, white Elmer's glue, in cases of gallon jugs. Just dump it in and mix it up, and then start pushing it on to these wooden forms that I would take a paintbrush and paint the glue onto the surface, push it onto the surface, and it would hold and it would crack because the understructure wasn't moving. The clay, as it dried, would slide, I think, across the surface of the still slightly wet glue beneath of it, and it would pull itself apart. And this led to a lot of earlier work where, I started painting the undersurfaces, and so the clay would crack, expose these undercolors underneath. I was studying these things in nails on 1-inch grid patterns. So I was pushing this clay all around between the nails,
Wow.
sticking out. And even then, so I would paint the nail heads, contrasting colors to the clay colors. And so I would have these fields of color almost sort of vibrating against one another. So it led me to all kinds of things. And so this is the first year or two I was there and at LSU. And on the sideline, I was invited to show in the glass show down in New Orleans at this time, but we didn't have a glass facility yet. And so I thought, well, how can I make something that is glass-like, but not glass? And so I decided to try to make some forms out of Scotch tape. And so we had on campus this thing called plant stores, which was basically a store that supplied office supplies to all the offices on campus and all that kind of stuff. So it was pretty close to our building. So I'd walk over there, and they sold Scotch tape in cases, cases of Scotch tape. And I'd walk in, first time, bought a case. And so what I did is I built a hardware cloth frame. I made cylinders, 4 cylinders that were 2 feet tall. And so they were about 12, 14 inches in diameter, about 2 feet tall.
Wow.
And I had this wire mesh, just metal screening, window screening. And I would wind the Scotch tape, sticky side down, on the screen. And wind it and wind it and wind it, and keep building it up until I got enough thickness to start holding its own shape. So, I go through a case of tape, go over to the plant stores, buy another case of tape, go over to the plant stores, buy 2 more cases of tape.
They probably thought you were crazy.
Go over to the plant stores. And finally, this guy was like, he sees me come in, like the 5th time over the last 10 days. And he goes, man, he said, what are you taping? I said, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. So anyway, I built these cylinders out of Scotch tape, and they really looked like spun glass. They really had this character. I'd made a base out of Scotch tape for them and taped it all together. And then the window screening, I could just fold in and pull out. So it was...
oh, okay, I get it.
These Scotch tape cylinders then were standing by themselves. And I called this piece surrogate information. It looks like glass, but it's not glass. And
I had no idea that we would be talking to you about Scotch tape. This is wild.
Actually, here's a curious question, Robert, because I remember my mom was a fiber artist, and she used to help jury and do the Pittsburgh Fiber Arts Guild's big biennial. And when fiber art sort of became a much more universal language, when people started using staples and hardware cloth and all sorts of other materials that acted like fiber, the Fiber Arts Guild embraced it, which seems like this would have been a perfect piece for the Fiber Arts Guild. How did the glass people embrace your Scotch tape? Because I think it would have, as they say in the UK, been a bit of controversy.
I can't remember precisely what the overall or what the so-called glass people thought, but I don't remember it being received poorly. I think they knew we didn't have glass at LSU yet. And I had a colleague of mine from Tyler, a graduate student, was now teaching at Tulane University in New Orleans. He was teaching glass at Tulane. Maybe he played a little role in people not judging this harshly or something. I thought it worked out pretty well. And so there were 4 cylinders that were just arranged in a line. And it was what you could do that looked like glass, but wasn't glass because you don't have glass.
So is that a precursor of things to come as you think about switching mediums possibly?
Well, so what I did is I worked that way for quite some time. I built a big piece at Art Park in 1980, and which was a big plywood constructed piece. It was 24 feet long by about 7.5 feet wide, 6.5 feet tall or so, and a big house-like form that we dug local clay, applied that to the surface. Instead of using glue, we were using Portland cement to stabilize it as sort of a little more adobe-like. And so for several years, I was working this way, and the work was receiving some attention. In the early 80s, I was very fortunate to receive a National Endowment Fellowship, which of course don't exist anymore. And that was all with this kind of work, National Endowment Fellowship in Sculpture. And that allowed me to take a summer which I spent in Europe, traveling through Italy and France, and looking at all of the stuff that I studied in school but never got a chance to see in person. I'm sure, affected my work in many different kinds of ways. My work in wood had always been in part, but it was always a substructure, for these clay veneers that went on top of it. And it wasn't until being here at the University of South Carolina that I was making a series of these wooden clay pieces. And I thought I wanted to make finials for the tops of these because they were rather architecturally inspired and had architectural qualities to them. So I thought, maybe I should buy a lathe and learn how to use it. And we had a lathe at LSU in the shop, but I think the only tools that were available were scrapers. And no one really seemed to know that much about it. And I turned legs for a piece that I was working on there once, but that was really about it. So I went out to our local tool supplier here in Columbia and bought a lathe, brought it home, put it in the studio here, started teaching myself to turn. So this was late spring semester, right? Just finishing up school, and I didn't teach summers. So I always kept summers as a time for working in my studio. And so I spent all summer, every day, 8 hours, 10 hours a day, trying to teach myself to turn. Joined the little local wood turning club and did that. So I got to the point by sometime in August where I felt like I could turn a lot of different sorts of forms, but I didn't know what to turn. I didn't want to make bowls, and I didn't want to become a bowl maker.
Actually, let me interrupt for a quick second here, Robert, because it sounds like the inspiration to turn came from an interest in architectural objects.
Right.
Because you wanted to learn how to turn finials. So what was the origins of that interest in architectural objects? Because obviously columns and forms and towers are a form you like to work in a lot.
Yes.
Had you always been interested in architecture?
Yes, I have been, Eric. I have been. It started from way back. And in my early years at LSU, I suppose. The great thing about being down in that part of the country was we were close to Mexico. I took several trips down to Mexico to look at Mayan architecture, just to see it. And it was, back then you could climb all over them. You can climb the pyramids and all that sort of stuff. And it was incredible. And so architecture had always been sort of that interest, but particularly architecture before architects. It was, those were the kinds of things, these sort of tight, enclosed spaces that I was really interested in. And I don't know if you've seen some of the really early pieces, the clay and wood, the ones that were studded in like matches or in nails or all that kind of stuff. Those were all about sort of those tight and close spaces, no doors, no windows, just this interior hidden space. Yes, architecture at that point was a big, big influence for me.
It sounds like you're talking about architecture when architecture was really truly a cultural phenomenon. People were expressing their culture in their objects.
Yeah, so I mean, those kinds of forms were playing a big role in what I was making and what I was doing then, and that's where that big piece of art park came in. Yeah, I think there were exhibitions going on at that time around the country, exploring the house as art image and all that kind of thing. But it had captivated my interest from early on.
You mentioned seeing a lot of this stuff like in school or while you were teaching, but then actually going to be able to travel, say, to Italy and other places to see it in person. What items or what areas of the world besides Mexico, because I know you talked about Mexico, that you actually saw in person struck you as much as Mexico did?
Well, in terms of the architecture at that particular time, I mean, Mexico was one of the biggest influences, I think. The trips to Italy and Europe were a little bit different. I mean, it was more of a historical look for me, and certainly the medieval towns and so forth that we went through was very interesting. But it wasn't so much the artwork, but it wasn't the thing that was driving what I thought I was making.
And this again ties back into your interest in the lathe. So let's pick that up again.
So at the end of the summer, I didn't know what I wanted to make. And I know I didn't want to make bowls. I didn't want to make pepper mills or, all the kinds of things that...
That was what wood turning was at the time.
And I will say, if there's a thread that you've talked about so far, is you aren't all that interested in functional objects. Is that a correct statement, or is that a false statement?
I think that's a correct statement, Eric. And so, but not so much functional objects. I mean, I make occasional things that sort of remarked about functional objects, but yes, not functional objects. I mean, I knew early on I never wanted to be a potter, particularly a functional potter.
Production potter, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of work. So, but at the end of the summer, I said, God, I mean, I think I just wasted, 3 months doing this because now I don't know what I'm going to do with it. And it was so funny. We have this, used to be a screen porch on the back of the house. And we had a couple of old New England lobster buoys sitting out there that my wife and I had collected by the time we drove through New England. I just happened to see those, and it was like, that's what I can do with the lathe. And it wasn't going to be hollow forms. And I just started making these solid buoy-like structures that I started.
Actually, could you describe a lobster buoy? Because I have no idea what a lobster buoy looks like.
These are probably very different from what they use today, but they are all wooden, and there is a kind of like at least the one I have, is a conical shape, about 20 inches or so in length, and it's got a stick, basically, stuck in the bottom of the center of this round conical form that hangs down, and I guess that stick is like a anchor or something. Maybe that's where they tie off onto. And the other part, the conical shape, floats in the water so they can find the traps, right? So that led me to what I've called the Earth Buoy series that I made, led me into that work, and then it has just continued from that point on.
So I'm curious, what about the buoy resonated with you? Because it's an interesting found object, or is there something about the buoy form or a lot that resonated with you that said, I want to do a series of pieces? Is there some sort of narrative? Is there something you hooked into about the buoy form?
Right. So years ago, when I was at LSU, I would, take walks along the levee of the Mississippi. I mean, we were very close to the Mississippi River. I would walk on the levee, top of the levee, and then down the Badger, and you would see buoys constantly used for navigation on the river. So I built a clay and wood piece that I called buoy. I had this big, I found a big tugboat chain that had washed up, and it hung in the middle of this form, and the piece was taller than I am. And so, but that was the only thing that I made. And when I saw this lobster buoy, and I started thinking about the idea of earth buoys, I felt it as almost sort of a continuation of the work that I had started down in Baton Rouge.
So the lathe becomes a new tool in your arsenal.
Yes.
As you continue to teach ceramics now you're at the University of South Carolina.
Right. So at the University of South Carolina, I came in as chair of the department of the School of Art here. And
that's in Columbia, South Carolina, right?
In Columbia, South Carolina. I had been chair previously at Auburn University for a couple of years. So I left LSU in 1995 after 13 years of teaching there.
So you moved to USC as primarily an administrator. You're
Yes.
no longer teaching at that point?
I was teaching, but one class a semester.
Right. So your freedom in the studio at that point is probably limited because...
Yeah, it was certainly more limited. And when we moved here, I didn't have a workspace. Soon after we moved in here, we started construction on the studio that I now use. So, a year later or so, I had the space to work.
Right, but I imagine a full-time administrator of an arts program is a pretty busy job, and you don't get summers off.
That's right. That's right. Eventually, I got to the point where I could take Fridays off, usually, maybe not all of them, but at least I had sort of a little longer weekend and could spend some time making things. I mean, for my work now, and even then, it's not so much about speed. I mean, it takes me weeks to make some things, and sometimes things will will be on the lathe for several days, before it comes off, or it goes back on, comes off, goes back on, comes off. And
so you're an administrator, you're still spending studio time, and then you go back to teaching full time?
Right. So after 5 years, I decided I was going to step down from the administrative position. And so I did that and just resumed back into the faculty and continued until I decided I wanted to retire.
And that was fairly recently, or?
That was 7 years ago. It'll be 8 years this coming fall.
Right. And at that point, you just want to focus in on your studio practice turning.
Yeah. And that's what I do now.
Let's talk about the lathe and your journey into wood turning.
So once I had this thought about making these earth buoys, that really it's captivated my interest since then, and still does to today. And it's you've seen, I'm sure, some of these more recent works. I say more recent, over the last 10 years or so, of pieces that are studded with pencils and all of that sort of thing. And that really, let's see. So I went to the ITE in 2009.
And actually just, so we don't like to play too much inside baseball. Say what ITE is.
Yeah, so it's the International Turning Exchange, actually the Wingate International Turning Exchange, which was, at the time I was there in Philadelphia, was sponsored by the Wood Turning Center, which was run by Albert Lakoff on Vine Street in Philadelphia, which has since moved it. It became the Center for Art and Wood and is now the Museum for Art and Wood. But before that, my mom got ill and started suffering from dementia. And I started thinking about, where do all of these thoughts and memories go? I mean, here's a woman who I could always rely on to fill in bits and stuff from years before. And, all of a sudden, it's like she couldn't remember. And so it started, this gave me thinking about memory and what happens to it. And it seems like it was something that could be erased, but yet maybe recalled. And so I started thinking about what could be some kind of metaphor for memory. I don't know exactly the moment that I thought about this, but I started thinking that maybe graphite could be a metaphor for memory. And what I mean by that is, here's a material that you can make a mark with. You can smudge, so it becomes difficult to see. You can erase it. And I thought, maybe this could really be something. So I just started turning up forms and drilling them on the lathe and inserting pencils. I would cut pencils into maybe 3/4 of an inch lengths, glue them into these holes that I drilled. And then I started finding, all kinds of things that would happen when I sanded them. The sandpaper would drag the graphite around the form. And so this became a big concentration for me, particularly during the International Turning Exchange. And so we were there in Philadelphia. We spent eight weeks, and this became this, for me, this foundational thing that I really started developing, started looking into turning things like not only, if you're going to turn pencils, why not turn an eraser? And so I started gluing erasers together and into forms. And you'll see on my website, there are pieces that are from this time. And so the pencil still is captivating me.
An interesting aspect of the pencil pieces is that on a lot of the pieces, the pencils are turned very sharp, as in incredibly sharp. To me, it's an interesting metaphor because, I like sharpening my pencils with my pocket knife or utility knife. But the sharpness of a pencil is one of the most transitory things because it stays sharp for one line, one mark.
That's right.
And then it's blunted. Is there a statement or is there a thought behind sharpening your pencils exquisitely?
Well, I think it became part of, I sort of imagined, writers and artists would sharpen their pencils, at the beginning of a drawing, right? But when I started putting them into vessels so that the sharpened tips were pointing inside, not only, it also sort of complicated the visual image, I think, and it started having sort of this semi-threatening kind of thing, sort of like these teeth or something pointing into the inside, but they were also fragile. And so they could be broken, but yet they're sharp. And so it has sort of these dual sort of visual thoughts, I thought. And so that's why I was always sharpening them. I hadn't really thought personally about sharpening them with the knife. I'd have to think about that. But it could hold some interesting possibilities, I would think.
So moving along, Robert, I'm just thinking of other prevalent forms, and the brush form also seems to show up a lot, and it's almost like the shaving brush form, not the sweeping brush, but these tufts of bristles.
Yeah, and those are more recent. Those are, certainly within the last year and a half. Those really just came out. I made a few brushes. I kept for myself and gave away as a couple of gifts for people. I just sort of liked the look and the feel of them. And so I started making feet for vessels out of them, as well as some of the forms that you're referring to with the brush tufts sticking out from the sides of them. Yeah, I haven't used them recently. They're not in the most recent forms. The most recently I've been turning cork. And cork in combination with wood, gluing cork onto wood and thinking about it as kind of a natural edge, as it were. But I like the texture of it. And a couple of the cork vessels have got push pins. I've made what I call a push pin pot with these push pins inserted into the sides of them, as well as making my own push pins out of pencils and cutting them up, cutting the eraser ends and the sharpened ends off, and drilling out the lead and fitting it with a push pin so that they could be almost like a bulletin board, as it were.
Right. Well, the push pin, those classic metal push pins, or the plastic, I assume too, but the classic metal push pins are actually a wonderful architectural element.
Yeah, they are, aren't they?
They're totally expressive of the human form because they are exactly what they look like. And I say this to differentiate the push pin from the thumbtack. The thumbtack is a different form. The push pin is actually a wonderful turned form, very elegant. So I guess that leads me, as we start to wrap this up here, what is your most recent work about? What are you? So you're working on these cork and wood forms with push pins, and what else are you working on?
So I have been just epoxying groups of pencils together and then turning these on the lathe. So, I'll have one pencil that's centered in the center of this group of pencils and turning them on the lathe so that you end up with kind of a single point, and all of these pencils coming down into one. And so kind of like this idea of focusing, or this one piece I call convergence. So, bring thoughts together, or as sort of this metaphor into these pencils grouped together. And so some of these I have some old recycled, they're like gym locker room bench tops, seat tops that are all laminated maple. And so I've made sort of these 8-sided forms, come at, just cut them so on the table saw so they bird mouth into one another, and then turn those on the lathe. So part of them is 8-sided, part of them is round. And so there are groups of pencils that have been glued together and sharpened that way on the multifaceted side. And then it goes up into the round section with pencils streaked across the surface, and then into a cork, almost like a vessel top that is pierced by sharpened pencils up at the top. And the base of this thing is also cork.
So are you getting ready for any exhibitions? Is this work going to be shown anywhere in the future?
It's going to be shown for sure at Momentum Gallery in Asheville. I'm one of the gallery artists of Momentum, and I don't have a plan at this time for a curated exhibition. But one thing that I would like to talk about, if you don't mind, is I remember in several of the podcasts, in the Why Make podcast, there's been a lot of discussion about art and craft, right? And the difference between art and craft.
Essentially the unanswerable question.
Well, I think, for me, the best definition that I've heard is that art is imagination with or without skill, right? So it could, maybe you don't have a lot of skill, but maybe you don't need a lot of skill, or it could be made by somebody else. But craft is skill with or without imagination. And then that leads into, you've had this discussion about studio craft and studio furniture and what all that is about. And I think that studio craft is where that imagination and a vision come together with skill and craftsmanship, right? And that's what sort of separates, when we think about art, I think we don't often think about Sunday painters and amateur or the hobbyist, I mean, we think about artists, who are working somewhere. But when we think about craft, it could be, anything from a trinket to mass-produced items to really, really finely made and beautiful pieces, right? And so when studio craft is at its finest, I think that that's where, a vision meets imagination, and it's combined with skill and craftsmanship. But it's not a new term. And I have my old A Potter's Handbook from undergraduate school by Bernard Leach, the English potter. And in here, Bernard talks about, and let me just read this, it is also plain that during the last 25 years, and this was published in 1940, by the way, the last 25 years, a far-reaching change in aesthetic judgment has come about, not only in England, but literally all over the civilized world. A new type of craftsman called individual, studio, or creative has emerged, and a new idea of pottery is being worked out by him as a result of an immensely broadened outlook. And, I think that, if you think about it like that, studio craft kind of starts making sense, and it is, probably a little bit different from what a general overview of craft may be. It's a more refined look, a more honed, more like what artists do, maybe. And it's, it kind of comes down to that, probably the best of craft, like the best of art, can be intriguing. It can be compelling, challenging, and maybe even inspiring, but also beautiful, right? And when those things happen, then we have the best of craft, I think.
Right, and I love the word craft and I hate the word craft, because to me, craft is just an element of art. In my explanation of craft is the technique one uses to apply to the idea.
That's right. And that's what I mean by imagination and vision coming together with skill and craftsmanship. Absolutely.
And unfortunately, academia has chosen to define craft by medium. That clay is craft, glass is craft, textile is craft, and wood is craft. But art without technique it's still art, but technique is the language of art, and craft is the language of technique. And it's hard to tease them all apart. It was interesting because I just spent the last 2 days at Penland, and I was talking with Mia Hall, the director of Penland, and we talked a fair bit about the future of non-academic institutions like Penland and the future of craft education. And
what did she say?
It's hard to boil down. Academia does no service in many ways to art education because it is just one element of an education. Whereas institutions like Penland allow people to immerse in their art, as opposed to academia where you take a class, but you still have to take English. And I won't say that a liberal arts education is necessarily a bad thing, but immersing yourself in art like you can in a non-traditional, traditional crafts program like Penland or Aramont, or, Anderson Ranch, or Haystack. It's a very different perspective. And you can take painting classes at Haystack. You can take painting classes at Penland. It's an interesting thing, but I think academia, by lasering in on certain aspects of anything, whether we're talking art history or English, does some disservice to the overall perception.
Yeah, perhaps. It depends upon how programs get set up and who's teaching at those programs. I think who's teaching is a big, big, big part of it, because I have always felt, the students that I have dealt with, that their job in school is to make their work. I mean, that's the real job there. Yes, you have to take other classes, but you have a longer time to do all of this, over an undergraduate career, at least 4 years, right? And if someone can continually work along that time, hopefully they can make good progress as well. The reason I ask is what her answer to that question is because a lot of programs are closing down. Like UArts in Philadelphia just eliminated their entire craft program. So I have a good friend of mine, Robert Milnes, who lives in Nashville now. And Robert, we met when he was director of the School of Art at LSU. He says he sees a lot of programs who are thinking about getting rid of these kinds of craft areas because students are interested in just sort of an immersive kind of thing for, say, 6 weeks or 8 weeks, go to a few places like Penland or Haystack or wherever, and then start working in your studio as opposed to going through a traditional educational career. But I don't know. I'm sure there are advantages and disadvantages on both sides of the coin.
It's crazy to see how people are like nowadays. Everything is just fast tracked. It's like, oh, I could, watch 4 YouTube videos and turn bowls. I went to an 18-month program and I thought that was not enough time to learn. And people are just doing things so much quicker nowadays. And now with AI, I saw this really interesting thing about design a chair out of rose petals in 15 seconds with an AI program. And this was an article in The Guardian, and it's like that 15 seconds could have been an idea, years, a lifetime of thought for a maker, and you just pulled it out from under this maker by doing that on an AI program. And it's just like the speed of all this stuff is the speed that people want and that they've become accustomed to, I think, is a lot of what's taking away from, making these craft programs and these intense long programs meaningless to a lot of younger people nowadays.
But, we're still seeing people who want to learn how to work with their hands.
Which is amazing. Thank you, Asma Golan, and other makers like that are working with their hands and promoting that kind of thing and promoting slow furniture or slow making, if you will. I mean, we all take time to make the stuff that we do, the three of us in our studios. And that's, there's not as much of that as there used to be, for sure.
Right. And in academia, also, the bottom line is enrollment and is the program making money.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing about academic craft programs is that in the end, it's the bottom line. I mean, it has nothing to do with the wants or needs of society.
No, not at all.
Academia has become almost entirely an economic-driven thing, especially big state institutions where the state legislatures largely control, unfortunately, the curriculum. And they say, hey, if you want to teach classic painting, great. We can always find 50 students for this. It's historically a part of arts programs. But, we're not going to find that $200,000 for the ceramics program. And of course, the other thing, you both pointed out that learning a craft is a lifelong proposition.
Yeah, it's not just a 2-month thing.
It's not a 2-month, it's not a 6-year thing. And the beauty of academia, I have always thought, is that it's a 4-year concentration in learning more technique than you'll probably learn in your own studio in 10 to 12 years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Eric. And I mean, my personal experience was, after undergraduate school, I not only wanted more, I needed more, and more input and more experience with other people who were, in my graduate class and all of that sort of thing. And it's not something that I'm not sure we as people are going to get that just through AI. I mean, the reason I sent you that thing, that Bard, when I asked Bard why make, it was because what I got back I thought was encyclopedic.
Oh, see, I saw it and I had not a clue. I didn't know what Bard was.
Wait a second. We had to think about that and base that on... I'm basing it all on that experience when you just punch a question in and it collects the internet for you. It's like, oh my God, that's so not fair.
But do you learn it? I mean, do you learn it in a sense that you can use it?
I can learn from it, but it's not.
Yeah.
But it's not the same. It's
not just a fact. I mean,
no.
I mean, you can tell me why you make the furniture that you make.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give me an insight into how you think about it, how it feels in your hands, why did you make this piece, Rob? Why?
Well, I mean, the thing that is at the heart of these programs that happens at the speed of light is a process that you need to be able to replicate, which is ideation through problem solving. And it's interesting that both arts and science, which use the same process, ideation and problem solving, is a skill that is rapidly disappearing from society. You can't create art, you can't create new ideas, you can't create technology, you can't create new knowledge without, one, making a supposition about reality, and two, using your brain to problem solve, to find a methodology for realizing it, period.
I mean, a week of sitting in front of a computer versus 20 years of sweat and dust in the shop. There's a massive difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just the sweat and the dust. It's about what you make. I mean, what it looks like and how does it make people feel? And it's about the shared human experience somehow.
And because you just gave the perfect place to end this, Robert, I'd like to thank you for being on Why Make. It is about the human element. That's why we make. And why make?
Why make?
Keep making.
You can listen to Why Make on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also grab our RSS feed or a direct download from our website, why-make.com.
This episode is currently brought to you by the Holy Pockets of Rob and Eric. Please help us build our creative funding base at Patreon. Patreon.com/whymakepodcast.
You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at whymakepod.
This episode is recorded on Squadcast and edited by us on Audacity. Thanks for listening.